Yo, welcome back. Yeah, that's my attempt at an introduction. There, so I've recorded this once already, like so many YouTube videos. So, something about me and turning my mic off, man. I don't know. But let's get into it. I made a sheet about usable weeks. It was principally because I was arguing with John Hogue on a few different podcasts, actually, about how there was a big difference in rostering a wide receiver 12 overall in PPR scoring than a wide receiver 36. Like, that's the thing he said. And I was like, what? And I thought usable weeks would be an interesting way of framing it based on what he had been talking about. But it's also already an established thing that I don't really, I haven't read into a lot of the research on it. But I know the basic concept. And so here's how I'm framing it. And what I'm using it for, and the sheet I created, and a quick tour on what's on it, because one of my patrons, I think it was Connor, right? It was you, Connor, asked me to do a video on it, on the usable week sheet I put out a few weeks ago. It's just a one and done, because I calculated it specifically because I wanted to argue with John Hogue, and needed a few extra numbers that I thought might make the debate a little more interesting, frame it a little differently for him. So I put it out. I used 444's data because I happen to have a history of weekly scoring going back to 2013 from 444 already neatly lined up as they give it to you when you sign up. So definitely check them out. When you're behind their paywall, I'm behind it because DLF has a partnership, and for the last few years, so I've been able to snatch some data essentially. All right, so here's how I'm framing usable weeks. Essentially, if you're starting, where do we start? One quarterback, two running backs, two wide receivers, a flex spot, and a tight end, right? So essentially, if you multiply that by 16 weeks, a full fantasy season, I guess that's 15, but let's stick with 16, then you need 112 usable weeks. And by usable, I mean a top 12 season for a top 12 week for quarterback, and also tight end, or a top 24, which is a fairly low threshold, especially for running back, finish for your running backs and wide receivers. Why? Because you're starting two every week, and you want to be in the top half of the fold every week, so that your team is competitive. And so it's a way of reframing what you're searching for, especially when thinking about season-long or seasonal production. You don't need the highest points per game throughout running backs and wide receivers, and just think about the number of weeks you need to be able to start your players and then be in the top half above the fold of scoring, giving you a good chance every week. Essentially, definitely getting to the playoffs and really giving you a good shot of getting into the final, and maybe even winning the final. 112 is a number, right? With that roster construction, obviously your mileage varies, and if we add in more variants like Superflex and Super Premium and so on and so forth, the number may change depending on the number of players you have to start. However, the thresholds really don't, right? That's why adding a second tight end spot is a lot more valuable than adding extra points for different things for tight ends, because essentially it doesn't change the number of usable weeks you're looking for. You still need to be in the top 12 every week at tight end to have a decent chance of winning that week. So the usable threshold stays the same. We can also talk about ceiling games, which is really where we're reaching for upside and where you lean more towards DFS. And I included it defining like a top 12 week for a running back and wide receiver to be ceiling weeks, because there's only 11 other players scoring in that bracket. And honestly, we should actually be a little more stringent with that, like the top 7 wide receivers, the top 6 or so running backs, the top 2 tight ends. We could get really specific with it, but instead I just stuck to the basic thresholds I think everyone's familiar with. You want a top 24 running back in your running back 2 spot, and that's a usable week, right? You're searching for those top 24 running backs because everyone's starting to. So in a 12-team league, 24 running backs are going to be starting every week, and so you need one of those guys to be in the top 24 scoring, because if it's not, you're at a significant disadvantage. Ceiling weeks are really where you're trying to reach outside scoring, for example in a DFS contest, where you don't just need to beat the person you're against that week, or one person, or even 12 people every week. You have to beat thousands, right? But I threw it in there because it's an interesting way of looking at the disparity between positional scoring and the value of those positions. Instead of talking about points per game or anything else, it's about how many usable weeks can you get from different running backs and wide receivers, how deep you go in the rankings. And I thought that would be an interesting way of looking at it as well. So that's usable and ceiling weeks explained, or at least my insight into them, or how I calculated the sheet. Usable weeks are top 12 for quarterback and tight end, and I think I've got that listed on all the headings. And usable weeks for running back and wide receiver are top 24. Not that that's all we're looking for, but that's just usable. That's a bare minimum, right? And for ceiling weeks, I use top 12 and top 5, conversing. All right, so let's take a look at the sheet. It's the post to is linked in the old description there. I'm going to pull up the actual Google sheet because mine looks a little differently. I move stuff around to hopefully make it a little bit more intuitive, because I have to keep the data in a certain format, so when I include new data, it recalculates everything, and it wasn't the most readable format. So this is what I came up with for the one and done public version. What do you think? My big fat face is in the way? I agree. Let me move it up slightly. Essentially in this, well, to start off with, I've just got my standard intro landing page, which is just lists of other databases you might want to go take a look at. Maybe, you never know, maybe sub somewhere, who knows, who cares. The second one is the usable weeks data. So this is the history of it, essentially. And you've got the position and the player and the team they were playing for and the season they were playing in, and just the overall PPR scoring, because that's how I rank them, top 12 overall in PPR scoring. Their points per game, and again, their positional rank based on those numbers, and the points per game positional ranks, that's different too, and the number of games they've played. All the way over here on the right, you can see their positional finishes in PPR scoring in week 1, 2, 3, and so it's listed out left to right. So Peyton Manning was quarterback 1 in week 1, quarterback 8 in week 2, and quarterback 4 in week 3 of the 2013 season. That's how he started and really continued the entirety of the 2013 season. Further on the right, you can see that actual points per game. This is the data that I'm essentially using to calculate percentage of weeks inside and outside certain thresholds. All right, so you've actually got the history of the data that you can dig back in and take a look at individual seasons. And also what I like to do is trying to see if there's any players outside of reasonable to include in the sample. Well, that's a weird way of putting it. Look, if Peyton Manning's going off for top 5 weeks, the first 5 straight games of 2013, that's an outlier kind of season. But how often does that happen? Not very, so he's probably skewing the data. Fortunately, there's only one Peyton Manning, and so he really only skews the data so much. But you could also find a player that's ranked positionally because of overall PPR scoring, like running back 43, that has 100% usable weeks, because he only played 3 weeks and finished in the top 24. So you can actually dig through the data to see if I've missed any of those outlier examples. In fact, what I did when I was calculating the averages is I used games played, and I only looked at players that played at least, I think it was, I'd have to pull up the actual sheet, I think I used a minimum of 8 games, 8 or 12 games. It's one or the other of the thresholds that I use. It's probably written down in here somewhere. I don't know off the top of my head. All right. Also, in the very first data tab, you can actually see me calculating the percentage of their games. I think it would be interesting to look at the percentage of fantasy games that player produced inside these different thresholds. I didn't do that for this sheet, but I think it would be an interesting way of looking for usable weeks. But in a way that around that game played filter, for example, it's like true points per game that I was calculating last year. You divide it by fantasy games that we play instead of the games the player plays, and then you see how much they actually produced for the fantasy season instead of in the games when they were available. But I just used the games that they played, and the percentage of the games that Peyton Manning played, he was in the top 5 62.5% of the time. He's in the top 12 75% of the time. In the top 24, never had a game outside the top 24 as long as he was playing in 2013, which is no surprise, and so the other percentages follow on from that. That makes sense? So again, if you had only played 4 games and this was at 100%, that's a little different than playing 16 and being in the top 24 100% of the time, or the top 12 75% of the time. But anyway, those are the individual players' percentage inside those thresholds. And I also did a count. So how many games did that account for? He was in the top 5, 10 games, 12 games, so on. So how many games finished inside those thresholds, as might be intuitive. Now, this CV ranking over here, I probably should have included a little bit more detail. Everyone in the Discord knows this pretty well, though, and we've talked about CV before. And the mathematical name, you get ready to write it down to Google it. I'll pause, because I'm assuming you're pulling up the Google tab. Coefficient of variation. It's the standard deviation divided by the mean. That's it. All it is a measure of how much variance there is in the data. It's essentially... Let's not get into what coefficient of variation is. It's based on graphs, but it tells you how much variance there is in a sample. It's a number we use for a lot of things. Bear in mind that consistency is a myth. It's definitely a myth. I use CV to kind of study consistency a little bit and found out consistency isn't consistent year over year, which makes it a myth. But it's not necessarily something we're searching for. If you're getting a player with 20 points per game and he has a great consistency score, that's what we want. But you could also have an inconsistent player like a Deshaun Jackson or a Brandon Ayuk or Chase Claypool last year that has large spike weeks and low weeks, which would measure as incredibly inconsistent, but he would still be a fantasy player you're searching for. So that is not in and of itself a measure of how well the player performed or anything else. It's just something I like to look at when thinking about how consistent is this production when looking at a broad view lens. And so I average the coefficient of variation when looking at the averages, just to kind of get a sense of how much variation at each positional rank or within each positional bracket there is. The only thing you really need to understand, apart from standard deviation divided by mean, is that 0% or 0.00, because I've got it in decimal places here, that would mean that there is absolutely zero variation in the data set. So 0 is good in the sense there's a lack of there's perfect consistency, that they were scoring 20 points every week that they played, for example. Whereas if they score 20 and 2 and 1 and 17 and -4, then there would be, well, I don't know what the actual number would be, but it would be closer to 100%, complete randomness or complete variance. Not randomness, variance within the data set. So that's essentially what coefficient of variation is meant to mean. And this is this player in this season's coefficient of variation across their positional rank and also across their PPR scoring. Again, I was mostly using that when looking at the average, but that meant I had to calculate it for the individual seasons, and following that you have the actual percentage that they were in the ceiling. They had ceiling weeks, they were usable weeks, and so on and so forth. Now, again, that's just because I want to know the percentage of weeks you're getting from Peyton Manning as a quarterback 1 that are usable in fantasy football, defining it as a top 12 season. As we just saw, that's 75%, and then in the next few tabs I was looking at the average of players to try and get a consensus of what or an idea of what you can expect within certain positional rank boundaries. Again, because I'm really just trying to argue with John Hogue. I also did N+1 just so we could maybe test consistency. Does a player continue to produce similar numbers of usable and ceiling weeks? I haven't run that R² test yet, but I threw it in there because I already had the data set up with a helper column. And so this N+1 column is their usable and ceiling weeks the following season. But obviously you also have to put a game threshold in. They have to also play 8 games the next season, for example. But anyway, I just threw those in there, and that's the whole first tab. The averages tab is where I start to actually look at some of the stuff that I'm actually interested in research. On a broad level, what can you expect from the quarterback 1, the quarterback 10, and then I was just averaging, if they played 8 games in full positional PPR scoring since 2013, what was their coefficient of variation in the positional rank and the PPR scoring on average for each positional rank since 2013. So these are all an average of every quarterback 1 that played 8 games or more since 2000. And by quarterback 1, I mean literally the PPR leader in points, or quarterback 36, literally the guy who scored the 36 most PPR points in every season since 2013. And so that's what an average means. And then you can see the average PPR scoring, their average points per game, which is where you get some loopy numbers because you do get players playing 8 games and therefore they're positionally ranked at like running back 15, but they're on a per game basis. They were scoring running back 5 numbers, and so it won't just be a clear descent always, because you do get, like, again, well, here's an example, a quarterback 9 scoring less on average than the quarterback 10. That's because someone missed games and they were scoring more points per game than the overall positional rank ended up being, I would imagine. Alright, so that's this entire sheet. It's the average of that data set that I've already looked at if they played at least 8 games. Their average usable weeks, their average ceiling weeks, and their average, I was just looking for if this was describable in a single number instead of having 2. So it's the average of their usable and ceiling weeks. Honestly, I probably should have just deleted this, but it's in there now, so there you go. I was also putting this in raw count form because I think that's a more interesting way of talking about it. For example, talking about these percentages is really fun for a nerd like me, but I think it might make more intuitive sense if instead of saying, the percentage of weeks they finish inside the top 24, top 12 and all that jive, what if we just said that running back, top 5 running backs average, what would that average be? I'm not in Excel, so it doesn't tell me at the bottom of the screen. Now I'm scrambling, but they average around 10, between 9 and 10 usable weeks, or 9 or 10 ceiling weeks, actually. That column is ceiling, dang! And you can see the value of those top 5 running backs, because when you compare that to wide receivers inside the top 5, and again, that translates to the literal number of games that you would have been really happy to have started them because they were scoring in the top 12. When we compare that to, say, wide receiver, you see a significant drop-off. There's an average of, between 9 and 7 usable weeks inside the top 5 for wide receiver. There's a significant difference in ceiling weeks for wide receivers that finish in the top 5 and running backs that finish in the top 5. And that's a positional value at work that we're always talking about. Ceiling weeks, usable weeks overall, you see, obviously you have a lot more usable weeks because it's a lower threshold. Inside the top 5, they're averaging, around 11 usable weeks at the wide receiver position. If we skip back to running back, then we see there's between 14 and 12. So again, it's slightly higher, but you see the numbers come back into... They come closer together when we're looking at usable weeks, that ceiling week, and that consistency. Like 12 games on average for running back 1 inside the top 12. You basically never had to take him out your lineup while you're searching for those 112 usable weeks for your overall roster, or 116 or 124, depending on your roster construction. All right, and so I just thought putting it into a number form, it just makes more vivid, it does to me at least, sense of how valuable positional groupings are. All right, but these are ranked by individual positions, but you can't go out and say, I'm going to draft the running back 1. Yeah, we're all trying to do that. Brody, I don't know, fictional Brody said that apparently. But it's much more safe and it's much easier. The larger the target you give yourself, the more likely you are to hit it. What if we just want to know what does a top 12 running back give us? Or a top 5 running back like we were just doing instead of these individual positional rankings? Or what I was just doing, but in a nice neat table instead of having to sift up and down. So that's what I've done over here on the right in the same tab. It's just called the average tab. So since 2013, quarterbacks that finished inside the top 5, 30, and that's a consistency scores, which again, we're not going to get into too much here because that can mean different things for different players, to be honest with you. But you can see the average PPR scoring, the average points per game, and you can see that on average they get 63% of games inside the top 12, which is really high for the top 5 quarterbacks, and that's why there's a significant drop-off for those difference-making quarterbacks that jump up into the top 5 every year, which is quite often Matt Ryan, for example, or Cam Newton, because he's done it a couple of times. Not this year, obviously. And you can see there's a significant drop-off for those ceiling weeks, or even usable weeks, at the quarterback position outside the top 5, and you can also see that drop-off at running back. At wide receiver, it's a little less of a drop-off, right? 47 to 32 is less than 60 to 37. That's like a drop-off of half half the percentage of usable weeks. And again, since that doesn't always make intuitive sense, we can translate that back into actual number of weeks just by multiplying by 16. So thinking about a fantasy season. All right. All right. So I don't want to get into breaking down the data too much because, again, this is mostly just to talk about what these things mean so that you can... I prefer for you to make up your own minds about things. I've already outlaid some other things I notice and will continue to do so, but I thought I'd throw that in there. Also, just because I was interested in it, I guess I threw in a Vorp calculation, and since not everyone knows what Vorp means, I'll mention it means value over replacement position. I've got the Vorp lines in here. People define Vorp, and there's other terms for it as well, based on how they set the baseline threshold. Essentially, it's the points per game above the positional rank you set as replacement level. And here I've got them set pretty high, so quarterback 13 was a replacement level, quarterback 13 was the tight end level, and so I've got them basically set at the usable week threshold. And I think clear Vorp actually goes to the type of player that you would be able to get off the waiver wire in a redraft league, which pushes it down to like running back 36 or 46. And it has a lot to do with it, but that's all I meant by Vorp, like the replacement value of those players over that usable threshold that I'm using for the sheet. It's not particularly relevant here. I haven't included it anywhere else. I was just sitting here. I was like, I could do a Vorp calculation to see, the value over my replacement while they get in certain number of weeks, and so on and so forth. All right, let's do a quick while we're here. I guess what I ended up finding out, what the type of thing I ended up quoting at John Hogue when we got to talk again, I think on his podcast, was when you look at running backs, you clearly see that valuable usable and ceiling weeks inside the top 5. It quickly drops out outside the top 5. In fact, we talk about the top 12 running backs, but outside the top 5, you're really seeing a drop-off, whereas if we scramble down to wide receiver here, like we just saw, there's less of a drop-off, which means top 12 wide receivers do provide more similar production than top 12 running backs to top 5 running backs. There's a smoother curve going on, but there is a significant difference, and especially when you consider that, when does this drop off happen at usable or ceiling weeks? It stops being about 5 usable weeks for wide receiver between like wide receiver 27 and 32-ish, whereas running backs, and that's just finishing inside the top 24. And when we go to running back, we see that it drops below 5 usable weeks. And remember, we're searching for 112 usable weeks. If you're looking for a number to compare those to, it drops off around about running back 36 or so. We're still seeing 5 usable weeks, 4 usable weeks for, running back 37. Ceiling weeks, it gets a little bit more drastic. If you're looking for ceiling weeks, you can get 2 or 3 ceiling weeks for running backs 20 all the way down. There's been running backs who had multiple running backs in multiple seasons who had at least 1 or 2 top 12 weeks in a given season. Whereas wide receivers scan down. What do we see? I actually don't know. I can't even remember what I looked at. It stops around, wide receiver 29 to 34 is where we're seeing similar numbers of usable weeks for running backs 36 to 30, whatever that I just said. So I do think, and one of the things I did found that confirmed the feelings that John Hogue was going, because he's going on feelings, is that there are about 7% of usable weeks being captured by wide receivers that finish outside the top 24 than compared to running back. And you can see that over, if you can see that, over here, which is a fancy sentence, but it just means, where am I? Top 24 wide receivers finish inside the top 24 42% of the time, which is okay, apparently, because that's what we're stuck with. Hang on. There we go. Yeah, I'm looking at this number right here in this box. Top 24 wide receivers finish inside the top 24 42% of the time. For running backs, top 24 running backs finish inside the top 24 49% of the time. So there's like that 7% difference. 7% more of those usable weeks are coming within the top 24 for running back than for wide receiver. I'll also point that factoring into that, top 24 running backs in a given season are more likely to be drafted outside the top 36, which also factors in, but let's not get too complicated with that here. Essentially, there is this feeling that wide receiver is deep, but it's not any deeper than running back, but you do get more top 24 weeks coming from outside the top 24 than inside of it when you compare it to running back. Now, unfortunately, that 7% also doesn't account for variance like players missing games, so they're actually scoring at a higher pace, and that average is dragging them down because of their overall positional rank. So I would take that down to about 5 to 6% more usable weeks are happening for wide receiver outside the top 24. They're also harder to capture because wide receiver is a lot harder to predict on a week-to-week basis, and it's harder to predict when a wide receiver is going to get a good boom game as a wide receiver 4 or 5 on his team, they catches that 100-yard pass, than it is to see a running back's usage increasing because of an injury, So all of that is wrapped up into that, 5 to 7% number. Anyway, that's what I ended up arguing with John Hogue the most. Anyway, the next tab was I like I told you before, I do like to see visually, because I'm very much an idiot trying to do this stuff. I want to be able to look point by point and notice if anything is out of line. So what I did is on the third tab is I created these average of bins, but by year. So you see all the averages up here, which is basically another representation of the tables I just showed earlier. But if we take out this average from 2013 to 2020, and just like the other seasons, essentially by position and by those different categories I was talking about, top 12, top 24, I wanted to look at the percentage of players inside the top 12, in this case, finishing inside the top 24 and inside the top 12, but I wanted to look at it on a season-by-season basis. For example, 2015 is almost always an exception, especially at running back. If we can scan down to running back here, where is it? It starts about here, and you see that 2015's numbers look drastically different. 2015 was a weird year overall. There's a lot of weird shit that happened in that year. We missed on nearly every running back we drafted in the top 12, for example. That was a Todd Gurley, TJ Yeldon year, if you remember it. There was a lot happening in 2015. And the reason I created this tab, and why it's included in your sheet, is so that you can look year by year and see if there's any outlier years drastically affecting the data set. Or maybe you're just interested to see if there's a pattern year over year. Do we regress in usable weeks? I don't know. But I like to visually be able to look at top 12 wide receivers every single season instead of just looking at the average from 2013 like the previous tab does. That's the reason this one exists, just so I can look year by year instead of just looking at the overall advantage without having to, like I typically resort to, creating a little helper column at the top where you can type in the year. But in this case, I just listed them all out one for one. And that's everything that's in this one, isn't it? Yeah. That's all of it. So you're looking at the positional categories that I just defined in the other sheet, laid out year by year next to each other instead of looking at the overall average like we are in this one. So yeah, that's it. That's the entire thing. In the sources tab, I've got my typical sources link, including the fact that all usable weeks data is coming from 4.4. Feel free to check them out. I think they're awesome. They've produced awesome content makers as well. I just noticed I don't have this. Freeze that, and then go ahead and freeze that as well, so that the headings stay where they are while you scroll. Let me know if you have any questions. I think it's interesting to think about usable weeks in terms of I am looking for 112 or 124, depending on how many flex spots or how many starters you have in your roster, and then look for where they come from. Now, again, this is one way that you can see there is a big advantage to having running backs in the top 5, because you're getting like 10 to 12 usable weeks out of them, whereas wide receivers you're getting 7 to 9. That's not as good, and also positional value of the scoring, there are fewer, because of that 7% number, running backs finishing inside the top 24 and along the top 12. But I think you can find other conclusions there too, like the fact that we may be overdrafting top 24 running backs. That's one of my personal takeaways, and that having a top 12 wide receiver does provide a significant advantage compared to having a top 36 wide receiver, despite what John Hogue was saying. Like, that's not just... That was a weird thing. He went a little too far for that. Wide receivers that finish inside the top 36 have 31% of the weeks are inside the top 24. Inside the top 12, it's 53%. So that's that's night and day. That's a wide receiver you barely have to take out of your roster just to get usable weeks, compared to one you have to be streaming pretty much every week and guessing when they're going to get that 100-yard game. It's as much variance as starting like the quarterback 36 versus the quarterback 1, which is kind of one way to compare it. But anyway, let me know what you think of it. If you have any other questions about usable weeks or how I made the sheet or where the data comes from or why I look so funny, actually save those questions for yourself. Hopefully the sound on this video. I really hope so. If not, let me know in the comments again, I guess. Thanks very much for checking out, and I'll talk to you again next time. Bye.